So this is my last review podcast for our unit on Christian art from the early Christian, late antique period through Gothic art. Whew! I used to teach this material over 2 units, and I feel as if we've broken some speed records this time around. The test is long, too. One day will be devoted to essays. I've already talked about these. The multiple choice test will have 2 parts, an image-based section with 67 questions on 13 works, and a general multiple choice test with 137 questions, but more than 80 of these are matching questions that you will have already practiced, I hope. Now that you're panicked, don't let this slide add to your worries. You do not have to memorize all these dates. You really only need a general sense of centuries, and I'll give you an idea of which ones you'll need to know in the review podcasts. Still, I personally find timelines helpful. The dates here should help you keep the late antique Byzantine and early medieval period straight. Particularly, you need to know about the arrival of Christianity as an approved and then official religion in the 4th century, the reign of Justinian in the 6th century, and iconoclasm and its end in the 8th and 9th centuries. I'll give you Romanesque and Gothic dates a little later. I'm going to talk about the earlier works first. This is a work from the Mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna. It is no longer a required work, but I've kept one test question from former AP exams because it's so representative of early Christian art, and therefore might show up again as an attribution question. So, who is the central figure in this image? The same figure appears in the Catacombs of Priscilla fresco on the right. While this is a biblical image, the late antique love of this imagery is based on what earlier art? The archaic sculpture in the bottom middle of the slide should give you a pretty strong hint. The division of painted spaces in the fresco that is divided into roundels is likewise influenced by, well, where are the frame paintings on the left located? By the way, there are catacombs questions that address information that showed up in your homework, but only briefly. The catacombs were used for burials underground. Land in Rome had become too expensive for graveyards or above-ground burials for any other than the very rich. Also, it used to be thought that Christians had hidden in the catacombs during periods of persecution. In truth, everyone in the ancient world knew where they were, so scholars now think that they would have made lousy hiding places and were not used for that purpose. The questions on this slide are pretty straightforward. I won't waste your time by reading them aloud. But to help you answer that last question, which was about the persistence of Roman spatial illusionism. Consider this manuscript illustration from the Vienna Genesis, one of your required works. We see what looks remarkably like a water nymph on the left. We see modeled bodies, but we also see a castle that appears to be floating off in space without any clear perspective or ground line. Looks to me as if illusionism comes and goes. The image on the left does not appear on the test. I snatched it from Wikipedia, but you should recognize the basic diagram and what it represents. You need to know the term. Note that the pendentive, that's the term, is a transitional element. Essentially, it enables a dome to sit upon walls. This term shows up several places on the test because closely related questions about pendentives appeared in many of my sources. I think you need to know this one. So here is another Byzantine work that is not on the required list, but has been on previous exams, and I think particularly well demonstrates important elements of Byzantine art, and therefore could show up as an attribution question. This comes from the apse of the Church of the Virgin at the Monastery of St. Catherine in Mount Sinai, Egypt. Remember that oval shape around Christ? We saw it in Buddhist art. So what type of work, what medium is this apse? Where would it almost always be located in a Byzantine church? Where would this kind of mosaic almost always be located in a Byzantine church? We've talked about the large oval surrounding Christ. Again, it's called a mandorla. Where is the light coming from in this work? Is it coming from a natural source or a supernatural source? Notice, too, the heavy contour lines that set off the figures. A reliance on line as opposed to shading or other illusionistic devices is characteristic of both Byzantine and early medieval work. Note that the work is quite similar to the icon that is one of your required images, and it's no surprise. They come from the same monastery in Egypt. So, what Byzantine features do you see in both? Well, again, there's the use of spiritual, unworldly gold. This is not naturalistic art. The figures are defined by heavy contours as opposed to modeling, although we still see remnants of classical modeling. Check out the knees on the icon. The figures are frontal and rather stiff. Christ in the apse portrait is Christ Pantocrator, Christ as ruler of the world. Note he's holding an orb and he's surrounded again by that oval mandorla. This is not the gentle good shepherd of early Christian art, but a Christ suited to the art of empire. Another big difference, by the way, is that one big difference is that icons were often meant to be touched and handled. Pretty hard to handle an apse mosaic. They were objects of personal devotion. Icons that have survived for centuries often have parts of their paint rubbed off, basically from centuries of handling. So, when was the work on the left made? By the way, the test gives you a hint. It says the work on the left is a rare icon that survived iconoclasm. Know your iconoclasm dates and you can figure that one out. The icon on the left is also painted with encaustic. It's a common technique for getting paint to adhere to wood. What is that technique? What materials are used? So what art historical period does the work on the left represent? We've really pretty much talked about that. What features of that work identified as belonging to this period? Okay, I'm going to repeat myself again. The shallow space, the lack of realistic perspective, the emphasis on line and contour, the frontal gaze and stance, also those long, thin features, and of course the use of gold. The eyes stare directly at us. Why? Well, for one thing, icons are intended to be works that communicate directly with the worshiper, to connect with them. Now, I'm going to close with the College Board, at least close for this image, with the College Board question that I consider a little unfair. I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm going to give you the answer if you stay tuned. The question reads, the materials and art-making process, my emphasis, it's not underlined on the test, used to create the work on the left demonstrate the influence of, and here are your choices, A, ancient Greek red figure vase painting, don't think so. New Kingdom papyrus illustrations, doesn't look like Hugh Nefer to me. Late antique Egyptian funerary portraiture, and D, ancient Roman wall paintings. Answer is pretty clearly going to be one of the last two, but you might be tempted to answer Roman wall paintings. The style is very similar to wall frescoes from Pompeii, and both Khan Academy and the reading from the textbook mention Roman wall paintings. They did not mention Egyptian funerary portraiture, which in fact turns out to be the right answer. So how could you get there? Well, first of all, if you read carefully, the question asks about materials and art-making process. The icon is made with encaustic, not fresco. Moreover, did you remember it was found in Egypt? Egyptian funerary portraits would have been very familiar to the people making the icon, and they were made of encaustic on wood. I've included an example on the right. Nevertheless, there's nothing in the College Board curriculum that suggests we should be teaching Egyptian funerary portraits. I think the question's a little unfair. On the other hand, I just gave you the answer. So, and this is an issue that comes up in your essay, why were these mosaics placed in San Vitale? To help you answer, let me remind you that the mosaic was placed facing the enthroned Christ mosaic on the apse, shown on the upper right. So Justinian is wearing the same imperial robes as Christ, the symbolic purple, which, by the way, is hard to make out in this version of the image, which is the College Board image. It highlights Justinian's role as Christ's representative on earth, and it presents him as a worthy successor to Constantine. Indeed, we see a deliberate reference to that first Christian emperor. One of Justinian's soldiers is carrying the Cairo shield of Constantine. Remember how the Cairo appeared before the Battle of Milvian Bridge? All of this imagery combines to communicate Justinian's power as head of both church and state. Justinian's image likewise appears beside the main altar in the apse. That's the most sacred part of the church where only the priest or the emperor could stand. By including himself, Justinian claims a kind of priestly power. Theodora is also found in the apse, but she's in a lesser position. Let me also note that we have no record of either Justinian or Theodora visiting Ravenna. Neither was ever sainted by the church. And while Justinian was the church patron, he didn't really bankroll it as far as we know. The church was almost entirely funded by a single wealthy individual called Julianus Argentarius, which is pretty much what we know about him. He was probably a banker, although he may have been an envoy from Constantinople. Moving on to early medieval art, how does this cross-carpet page from the Lindisfarne Gospels demonstrate the influence of migratory metalwork, such as the fibula shown on the right? Well, is there a narrative on the carpet page? Any modeling or shading? I don't think so. But what about figural elements? And that's tougher because both of the works clearly include zoomorphic images. But are these images the focus of the cross-carpet page? No, not really. I would say the focus is on the cross. So what artistic element do they clearly have in common beside the zoomorphic figures? What kind of pattern do we see? What is the term that we use to refer to those elaborately intertwined lines? So what was the function of this work? What was it used for, quite specifically? What technique was used to create that fish pattern? Where were these objects found? What was characteristic of this and other migratory art? In other words, what is characteristic of art that moves with people? These questions, too, are self-explanatory. The image on the right does not appear on the exam, but there is a question about the characteristic features of Hiberno-Saxon manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels. So what kind of figures do you see on this and other similar manuscripts? Well, these figures show the influence of migratory art. We've just talked about that. But what aspect of the Lindisfarne Gospel shows classical influence? Big hint. What language is it written in? Finally, and this is a comparative question, which of our prehistoric works shows carved, zoomorphic, or animal designs? Note I said carved animal designs and not carved animals. Okay, here's a question that caught me by surprise, but I included it just in case the source is right about what the College Board will want you to know. Luke's symbol is a calf, sometimes an ox. What meaning does that convey about Luke and about Christianity? Why this particular attribute? Well, here's Wikipedia's explanation for all four of the attributes, edited by me. And you'll find the answer to the question here. Matthew the evangelist is symbolized by a winged man or angel. Matthew's gospel starts with Joseph's genealogy from Abraham. It represents Jesus' incarnation or birth as a human, and therefore it emphasizes Christ's human nature, hence the man. Mark the evangelist is symbolized by a winged lion, a figure of courage and also a representation of monarchy. The lion is also seen as representing Jesus' resurrection, believe it or not, because lions were believed to sleep with their eyes open, and this was considered a comparison with Christ in the tomb. And of course, Christ is the king. Luke the evangelist is symbolized by a winged ox, bull, or calf, animals used in sacrifice, and also symbolizing service and strength. Luke's account begins with the duties of Zacharias in the temple. It represents Jesus' sacrifice in his passion and crucifixion, as well as Christ being a high priest. So the ox or calf signify that Christians should be prepared to sacrifice themselves in following Christ. John the evangelist is symbolized by an eagle. He's a figure of the sky, believed by Christian scholars to be able to look straight into the sun. That's the eagle, not John. John starts his gospel with a kind of eternal overview of Jesus as the Logos and goes on to describe many things with a higher theology than the other three more narrative gospels. So John's eagle represents Jesus' ascension and Christ's divine nature. So now you know. Still more self-explanatory questions. So, during what art historical period was this work made? Just talked about it in the Church Architecture Review. It pairs scenes from which two parts of the Bible? What purpose did it serve? What was it made of? And how? And again, I talk about this some in my first Church Review podcast. As we move into the Romanesque and Gothic periods, really the dates get easier. Basically, the central Romanesque period goes from 1050 to 1150, the central Gothic period from around 1150 to 1350. Another way of thinking about this is Romanesque, 11th century, Gothic, 12th century, the 13th century is still late Gothic, but it's when things begin to fall apart. So the image on the left is one of your required works. The image on the right is not. but it's shown up on the AP exam before, and the two works serve the same function. I could easily imagine the College Board using the image on the right for an attribution question. Remember that one of the learning objectives is to be able to attribute a work of art to an artist or a period based on its similarity to other works you have studied. So what are these objects? Note that they're both made of precious metals and are heavily encrusted with jewels. What saint does the work on the left represent? Or really, more accurately, the relics of which saint does the work on the left contain? Where would either of these works likely be found, at least before they showed up in museums? What period is this kind of work most associated with? And there are some other specific questions about the Santa Fe reliquary. Since I did not go over this in class, although it was discussed in the video you watched, I'm going to give you some serious help. Santa Fe, or Saint Faith, was a 12-year-old girl who was executed sometime around the year 290 during the persecutions of the Emperor Diocletian. She refused to make pagan sacrifices. The relic inside this reliquary is the head of a child, said of course to be the head of Saint Faith. One interesting note, those Fang reliquary figures also sat on top of boxes that contained ancestors' skulls. Why were idols criticized in the early Middle Ages? We come back once more to iconoclasm, very popular topic. So another interesting note, the head of the reliquary statue was made of a different gold than the body, and it was pretty clearly made separately and attached. Maybe it's the head of a late Roman emperor, that's the most common theory, but at least one art historian thinks it may be a death mask of Charlemagne. And again, what do these two works have in common? I really just gave you that answer. What do these statue groupings have in common? Note the relationship to architecture. A little ahead of myself there. So these are images from the Bayeux Tapestry. What event is this tapestry describing? Is it an actual historic event? What people were involved? How was this work made? What is its medium? What materials were used? Does it contain text? And if so, in what language? Also, what earlier work from this course depicts actual historical events using a continuous narrative frieze, different medium? Many of you wrote about this work in your Power and Authority essays. Still more random questions. This is no longer a College Board required work, but it's been a very popular past AP work. It is a McConnell-Jacobs required work. And since it's a longtime College Board favorite, I could really imagine it showing up as an attribution question. So, what art historical period do these sculptures date from? What is the subject of the two figures on the left as you look at the sculpture? And to give you a hint, the two figures are the angel Gabriel and Mary, and from that you should be able to guess what's going on. The word for this event in the Christian narrative begins with the letter A, and it's included in the title of the work. The figures on the right reflect the influence of what earlier style? I think you can figure that out if you look at their clothing or drapery. And what about the figures on the left? Well, what kind of influence directed the style of the dedication page of the Moralized Bible? Who is directing the production of illuminated manuscripts and of major church cathedrals in this period? Finally, how do these figures represent an important advance in sculpture, particularly architectural sculpture, characteristic of this period? How has it been evolving from Romanesque to late Gothic periods? It may be easier to answer this if you look at this earlier image from Chartres, although this is not actually, I believe, from the Royal Portal. But you should notice some changes. You may want to consult your church floor plans for this last question. What were the two main forms of Gothic two-dimensional art? The College Board does not give you the answer the way I have by showing these images. Note that I talked about the image on the left in my last classroom podcast. Even though it's not a required work, I could easily imagine this or a similar statue showing up as part, again, of an art historical period attribution question. So, both of these statues date from which art historical period? Both reflect what religious development in this period? There's a special devotion to which religious figure? What is the term for the seated statue? The term that's also the title of the work. It's a term you'll need to know in the next unit as well. What medium, that is, what material is the seated statue made from? And what is that distortion and anguish in the sculpture intended to inspire in the viewer? By the way, you need to make sure you know what the word empathy means. It shows up in one of the questions, and it's one of the responses that artists will try to solicit from their audiences. You should also know that polychromed means painted with multiple colors. It is not the same as encaustic. You should also know just how big the statue on the right is or is not to help you answer one of the questions. Last slide. What is the relationship between these two works? Who is the patron of the work on the left? Who donated it to the church? What political development does this portrayal of Mary signify? And how is it reflected in the work on the right? Okay, I've thrown a lot of material at you. The good news is we're almost done for the semester. A break from art history is coming soon.